Welcome to the History Makers, Blacks in Sports. How well preserved is the history? My name is J.A. Adande. I'm Director of Sports Journalism at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. With me today are NBA legend, the Hall of Famer, and past president of the NBA Players Association, the Big O, Mr. Oscar Robertson, and the All-Pro NFL guard who blocked for Jim Brown and the founder of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, Mr. John Wooten. And also our panel, Michele Roberts, the Executive Director of the National Basketball Players Association, DeMaurice Smith, the Executive Director of the NFL Players Association, and Tony Clark, Executive Director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. And let's talk about how African Americans have historically been a driving force in baseball, football, and basketball as we know them today. Let's go first to Oscar Robertson. We know that African Americans have been playing basketball since E.B. Henderson's, the father of black basketball, introduced it to Washington, D.C.'s 12th Street YMCA back in 1904. When you were coming along, George Crowe, a black man, was the first Indiana Mr. Basketball. Bill Garrett was the first black basketball player at Indiana University, and Ray Crowe coached your Crispus Attucks High School team to the first black state high school champions in the country.
No, I was not familiar with that. We primarily came into Cleveland as a young guy out of University of Colorado. We certainly knew the history of the Cleveland Browns because of Paul Brown and his work there in bringing the first blacks into the National Football League in 1946.
Yeah, certainly the integration of the NFL in 1946 had roots in Cleveland with Marion Motley and Bill Willis of the Browns, and then Kenny Washington and Woody Strode of the LA Rams, right? And can you describe what they went through and what barriers they had to get through in order to integrate the NFL?
Well, I think that we got to give credit to Paul Brown on the fact that he went up against George Halas and George Preston Marshall in terms of making sure that he could have on his ball club both players that he wanted, not based on the color of their skin. As you well know, from 1933 to 1946, blacks were banned from playing in the National Football League under the direction and leadership of George Preston Marshall and George Halas. So this is why we give credit to Paul Brown in terms of what he was able to do, and said very openly that if he came into the National Football League from the American Football Conference, that he would bring players that he wanted on his ball club, no matter what color they were.
And how did you learn about the trailblazers like Bill Willis, like Marion Motley?
Well, I was very fortunate as a young guy playing out in Colorado. We were very familiar with the Cleveland Browns. And consequently, when I was drafted into the Cleveland Browns organization in 1959, Bill Willis and Marion Motley were around all the time, around the facility and so forth. And let me just interject this. Knowing how much Marion Motley wanted to coach in the National Football League, he never had that opportunity, but I knew in his heart from listening to him talk how he wanted to coach, and this is what pushed us so directly in terms of trying to make sure that blacks would have that opportunity to coach in the National Football League. And that is the real purpose of why Fritz Pollard Alliance came into existence.
And certainly Oakland Raiders coach Art Shell was the first black head coach since Fritz Pollard when he was named head coach of the Raiders in 1989. And how is the Fritz Pollard Alliance documenting this struggle for diversity in football that you mentioned?
Well, we're headquartered there in Washington, D.C., and of course, all of this is in our archives as it relates to the growth and what we've been able to do over the years. It was just 2 or 3 years ago that we had 8 black head coaches, 8 minority general managers in the National Football League. And of course, that is why that fight goes on and on today from that point.
Oscar and John, you both know that black athletes played a major role in free agency and the risks that were involved. NBA players had a lawsuit going on in 1970 about the same time that Curt Flood was suing Major League Baseball. Oscar, can you tell us about your role in bringing about free agency for the NBA?
Well, initially, when I got involved with the Players Association, I was asked by some friends of mine, Jack Plummer and Tommy Heinsohn, to take this position as president of the association. And I didn't know, no one knew what was going to happen. We just felt that things should be better for basketball. When the ABA came along, I don't know what year it was, but they had played 3 or 4 years, and then they felt they wanted to join the NBA. There was a lot of talk about that, and we felt that as players, we felt the competition with salaries and whatnot shouldn't be that way. Then we got involved with the Oscar Robertson rule, where we went to court. We went to the Congress, and we also did a lot of things with different players all around the league to make them aware of what was going on, which I think was a real key ingredient, because all the players knew. Because during those days, I must tell you that if you were not a player standing, they would get rid of you if you were a player representative. And we knew this, so we had to select the right players, and we kept the communication going so players would know what's going on. And eventually we went out. We went out to a situation where players, if they didn't have a contract, they would be able to go out and go to another team. But you know, if you look at all that the Oscar Robertson rule and whatnot, everyone says it's all the players. But I think if owners were not receptive of the idea where they could get certain players, then it just never would have happened. Because during those days, there were always trades going on, just that the owners controlled the trades and whatnot. But then when the players got a little power with the Oscar Robertson rule, it became a little different game.
Mr. Wooten, the NFL had more free agency stops and starts. Can you tell us what role African Americans played? And I think there was a special role played by John Mackey.
You're absolutely right. And like Oscar just pointed out, that in the old days, if you were a player rep and you weren't a star player, they would just waive you or trade you or whatever. But when John Mackey came in as president of the Players Association, he was a star player coming out of the all-pro tight end out of the Baltimore Colts. And the thing that he did more than anything was that he filed a lawsuit against the NFL in terms of what we were calling the Roselle Rule. In other words, back in the old days, if you played out your option of your contract and you went to another team and the teams couldn't agree on the compensation that the team would get for signing you, then Roselle, the commissioner, was in position to determine what that compensation should be. And of course, John Mackey filed a lawsuit saying that this was illegal to do and won that case. Every single player playing today in the National Football League should be jumping up and down and saluting John Mackey, because that gave 1992 the great free agency that you have today and the compensation that players are making in the National Football League.
Thank you, Mr. Wooten and Mr. Robertson. And now let's turn to our panel. We've heard about the integration of pro sports. We hear less about the integration of the player unions. So to what extent did the integration of the unions move in parallel to the integration of the leagues? And I'll start with you, Michele Roberts.
Yeah, you know, our union didn't even get formed until 1954. So a lot of people think the unions have been around for hundreds of years, not ours. We're a relatively young union, and even after being formed, the owners didn't recognize it for 10 years. I mean, it was out there, but it was toothless. I would like to think it's not a mere coincidence that as the game became more integrated, the players began to feel more powerful. A lot of what was going on, at least in terms of the strengthening of our union, happened and coincided with the civil rights movement. And so I think a lot of our players, and black and white players, were emboldened by the examples being set by the civil rights, in the civil rights movement. And I think that contributed mightily to the courage that the players ultimately expressed in dealing with unions. So the notion of not playing and risking no money, that's the same time we had the Montgomery boycott going on. So people of color were expressing their political power in ways that I think affected our players. And given that the number of African-American players was growing, I don't see that as a coincidence, that the immersion of more people of color into our union had something to do with the union becoming stronger.
And DeMaurice Smith, can you describe the process in the NFL?
You know, our union has a similar story to Michelle's, and Mr. Wooten hit the nail on the head. We have a relatively young union, 60, nearly 70 years old, but at the time when our union was formed, exactly like both the NBA and in baseball, the owners refused to recognize the unions as the exclusive bargaining authority for the players. John Mackey became the president of our union in 1972 when there was a merger between the AFL and the NFL. I think the fact that a star player of color chose to risk everything to become the president of a union, and then as Mr. Wooten talked about, filed a lawsuit in 1971 that wasn't resolved until 1993. That's the power of people of color stepping into leadership positions, and let's be blunt, taking on the owners head on over the issue of not only what rights players have on the field, but what civil rights players should have as individuals.
And Tony Clark, of course, baseball has the most famous story of integration in sports with Jackie Robinson. The story of the union, though, is not as well known. Can you fill us in about that?
Sure can, and it tracks much like the stories you've heard in the NFL and the NBA. Going back, however, to the late 1800s is when the first discussions about unionizing the players actually began. It isn't or wasn't until 1966 where our union settled in its current form. So there were attempts over a long period of time to try and organize the players. But when Marvin Miller was put in a position in 66 and our first collective bargaining agreement was negotiated in 68, much like Michelle offered, the civil rights movement spoke into and encouraged and empowered our players at that time as well, such that Curt Flood in 1970 challenged the reserve clause in our industry. Up until that point, the experience had been that once you signed with the team, you remained on that team until the team decided what they wanted to do with you. After 12 years in St. Louis, and again, encouraged and empowered by the movement, the civil rights movement, Curt challenged it, pushed the envelope, sued the league. And so it was against that backdrop that we as an organization really settled in under tremendous leadership by Marvin, but undoubtedly against the backdrop of what we were seeing in our own individual cities and states and country, but truly moved when Curt pushed the envelope in 1970.
And now, of course, we have the point where the leadership of the unions represented here on this panel are people of color, and the NBA and NFL unions are primarily made up of people of color, and significant number of people of color in the baseball union, negotiating against a primarily white management group. And I'm wondering how those racial dynamics come into play as you enter these labor negotiations. I'll start with you, Michelle.
They definitely enter. I mean, I think the others do as well. Make sure that our players are engaged in these conversations, and to the owners' chagrin, because they still, unfortunately, don't believe that these men are intellect. But sadly, as we sit across negotiating tables, we don't see people that look like us. That's unfortunate. That hopefully will be something that will change, especially given the conversations that we're having of late. We've had it of late with the league. But it does create some, at least, difficulty in getting people on the same page as soon as we need to be on the same page. our union is, most of my executive committee are men of color. And most, as you pointed out, most of my members are men of color. My senior management team is both of color and not. But the leagues and the teams are taking a little too long to figure out that people that don't look like them may actually be able to make a contribution to the conversation, that if nothing else can expedite some of the I hate to use it, but prejudices that people walk into some of these conference rooms with. So, it's not unusual as a lawyer, it's not unusual in the profession to have to contend with a very small number of people of color and women. But given the racial composition of our sport, it's an ugly irony that the league is so far behind, both its players and even its unions, and appreciating that diversity really does make a positive difference in our business. So it is what it is.
DeMaurice?
It's similar. I think the battles for all of our unions follow nearly the same track. We all sit across from the tables as players, engaging in collective bargaining with an ownership group that doesn't look like us. As I'm sure Mr. Robertson knows, once you decide that you are going to be a union president, in no small way, the management decides to declare war on you, as well as the other players. And when you're engaging in collective bargaining with the league, virtually none of it is pleasant. Almost none of it is even from a legal standpoint, anything that's short of hand-to-hand combat. So, we share a history like all of the other unions in sports, that when players decide to try to exert their power, the league responds with trying to exert control. And that either plays out in lawsuits or plays out at the collective bargaining table, or, as we've seen in the last few years, plays out publicly. Our players came out of the tunnel in St. Louis after a young man was killed by the police, and that was 7 years ago. Our fights, on behalf of Colin Kaepernick and others, continue to fight. To Michelle's point, you've seen the league, make some moves, but what I think is really important is in almost every situation, the players have been on the right side of history long before a time that the league comes to agree with them. And what you do see, over the arc of history is management coming to the position of recognizing something that the players have declared to be right and just and moral years before the owners get there. So, we would all want a world where those fights, would not be fights, or the fights would be easier. But the fact is, players have tended to be on the right side of history only to find out, many years in the future where the ownership catches up with them.
And Tony, the fact that the majority of baseball players are still white, does that change the dynamic at all for you?
Well, it is something that is obvious, particularly when you take into account the memberships in the NFL and the NBA. But I know as a player coming into the league in the mid-90s on the heels of the longest work stoppage that our industry had, 94, 95, and getting involved with the union as a player rep after my second year. I don't recall ever being in the room with the league and looking across the table at someone who looked the way I did. Fast forward to when I finished playing in 2009, despite having been involved throughout, and now as an executive following my player career, I still have yet to sit across the table and see someone who looks the way that I do. And it's ironic against the backdrop of something you started with earlier, J.A., which is our history and the fact that we do celebrate Jackie Robinson and our industry and our game going back to 47 when it was integrated. And unfortunately, we celebrate that integration every year around the same date. And we seem to get a lot of media and a lot of press around that same date. And then it fades into the background. Now, there has been and continue to be a lot of discussion going on, both behind the scenes and publicly to a certain extent. But the truth is, unless or until we sit in a room and we're seeing a far more diverse group of individuals involved in the process, I firmly believe we will not be enjoying the benefits that our industry and our league could truly be enjoying by being more diverse. And so our staff reflects our membership, far more diverse than it has been. And I do believe we continue to position ourselves to best represent our membership as our membership grows and adjusts and adapts. But unless or until the industry truly embraces a much higher level of diversity such that we sit in the room and have very candid dialogue about how to move the industry forward with views that are different perhaps than those that you're sitting next to, we're not going to be what we're capable of being in the overarching conversation of professional sports.
Now I want to turn to a moment that happened in the summer of 2020 following a police-involved shooting of a Black man in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the Milwaukee Bucks from their stayed in their locker room and didn't play a game against the Orlando Magic. And that shutdown quickly spread throughout sports. NFL teams didn't practice, baseball teams didn't play, tennis, and throughout the sports world, it was labeled as a strike or a boycott. And I thought those were misnomers, right? Those are terms related to labor union actions or targeted mass movements with a specific endpoint. That didn't seem exactly what was happening here. So I'm wondering, what terminology would you use to describe what happened, starting with you, Michele?
I wouldn't use boycott or strike for reasons I won't bore you with. And you're absolutely right. This had absolutely nothing to do with the sort of traditional labor conflicts that would typically lead to some sort of work stoppage or strike. What it was, I call it a roar. Our players that morning, this is all taking place at the Bubble in Orlando, and I happened to be down there. And that morning, when I and the rest of the guys down there learned about what happened, the atmosphere was electric. There was so much energy, most of it being anger, that was palpable. There was the pain that these players were feeling about seeing this happen yet again, after all of the angst that had been expressed by them and the rest of the country just months earlier, was amazing. And what I called it was, these guys wanted to be heard in a very loud and pronounced way. And they knew that the most immediate way to do that was to not play. You can get on the court and do a press conference and say what happened in Wisconsin was terrible. But they knew that what would be heard the loudest was a refusal to get on that court. And when they did it, their brothers on the other teams that were also scheduled to play that evening responded in kind. And it was, to me, it was like, I'm a bit of an animal freak, but it was like watching a lion or many, many lions roar to get attention. And they got the world's attention. And what warms my heart is that it's not something confined to only NBA players, only NBA African-American players. The sports community, the athletic community, Black and white, roared as well. And it got everyone's attention. And to the extent people thought that page had been turned, it had not been turned. We ended up getting some constructive things out of it. But at that moment, I call it the day the players roared.
And DeMaurice, how did this come to be a part of the NFL moment as well?
Well, I think you're absolutely right not to limit or define this in legal or labor terms, I would call it an expression of the players' power and their voice. None of them came to, the staff. None of them came to me, as none of them would, to ask permission or to let us know what they were going to do. It was an organic expression of their voice and their power to simply tell their coaches that there would be no practice that day, that players would be walking out. And to me, the beauty of that is not only the strong expression of their voice, but two more things. One, telling the world that they are inextricably tied to their community. So as athletes, they're not somehow separate. They're not selfish. They're not living in their own world. I think that's a really powerful expression. But number two, and equally important, that they're not going to go away. And I think that all of us to a certain extent work in the business of entertainment. And that is a great thing. But sometimes you can be, to borrow a Neil Postman line, you can be entertained to death, right? And I think a group of workers, athletes in this case, making a decision that they understand that they're there to play a great game, to have fans connect with them. But on this day, there is something more important than that. And I think all of us watching that unfold in a organic, powerful, and individual way really demonstrates how closely tied what we are doing today and how it is connected with a traditional civil rights movement that certainly has preceded all of us and hopefully will extend far beyond the time that we're done.
Tony, the most dramatic moment might have been in the Mets-Marlins game when they both lined up and then left the field and left a jersey behind at home plate. How did baseball come to embrace this moment?
Well, let me start first by echoing what Dee and Michele offered, which was this was not labor or legal on any level. As much as anything, there were conversations being had in locker rooms in baseball that I don't recall having happened in a long time. And so when the Milwaukee Bucks and the rest of the NBA players took the position that they took on the heels of the conversations that were happening in baseball locker rooms, the unity and solidarity and awareness across sports among professional players really jumped to the fore. And our guys were very interested in having their voice heard as part of that group. And so I actually did get calls from our guys where they were letting us know this was what they were going to do. So it wasn't an ask. It was a letting us know this is what they were going to do. And as much as anything, why? So it wasn't a blind step out of the boat. There was purpose. It was deliberate. It was organized from the standpoint of guys coming together across the league, not organized meaning that planned or anticipated or expected, but organic from the standpoint that Dee mentioned. And the game that you highlighted was one of the games where there was a lot going on behind the scenes, suffice it to say, by that time, considering what all was happening across each of our sports. And it culminated in the guys wanting to make a statement in the fashion that they did. And so some of the statements made were similar, some were a little bit different. But there was no doubt that the guys' voices being heard as part of the awakening that we have seen, both in our games and outside our games, as Dee mentioned, in our own individual communities, really moved to the fore. And so the conversation that was started continued and continues to today.
Now we'll go back to looking at the historical perspective now, and the baseball and the football and basketball halls of fames feature displays documenting the great African-American contributions to their sports. I wanted to, do the players maintain similar archives among the unions, among the labor representatives, that make sure you document the African-American contributions? And Tony, I'll start with you.
Well, interestingly enough, we are in the middle of archiving as we speak. The work that has been done in coordinating all of the documents, all of the files, has gone on now over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, and will continue for some time, considering the history and the experiences that our organization and union has. But one thing that is perhaps not dissimilar to the other professional sports, there's a lot of our history kind of spread out all over the place. So we do have a lot of our union-specific, collective bargaining-specific history here within the organization, and much of that story has come out piecemeal over the years. But as it relates to Blacks in baseball and our African-American history from start to finish, it's really spread out. And a quick story as an example, as a player, I had an opportunity to go to the Hall of Fame after my second year in pro ball. And at the time, there was a section in the Hall of Fame called the Negro League section. I believe it's called the Pride and Passion section now. And it really wasn't until I went to the Hall of Fame and I was able to sit down over the course of 2, 3, 3.5, 4 hours and learn our history, learn my history in a way that I hadn't heard or learned before. And so leaving the Hall of Fame, devoted myself to trying to find more, and I did find more. I found more within the Players Association. Once I got to the big leagues, I found more of our history as part of the Negro League Museum, which is in Kansas City. I found more information tied to a number of the foundations, Jackie Robinson Foundation, Josh Gibson Foundation, and so our history really is found in a number of different places, while most of our union's history, at least the files and documentation that we have, is more directly tied to collective bargaining and those players that were involved in fighting and protecting player rights over the years.
Michele, what are the NBA players doing to preserve and protect their history?
That's such a good question, because about 2.5 years ago, our foundation, it's similar to what Tony just described. We went to the Hall of Fame in Springfield and saw that there were some tributes to athletes of color, but very little was said about the union. And so we, again, 2.5 years ago, decided that we could start an archival project. And we actually commissioned a group to work on putting together an exhibit at the Hall of Fame that we did specifically with the history of the NBPA. And its opening coincided with our 65th anniversary last year. And again, as we speak, we're taking advantage of this quarantine, semi-quarantine, and got a whole bunch of our documents that were in storage for years to try to make sure that we can preserve our history. And because, again, so much of our history involves athletes of color, by definition, it's a history of African Americans in sports, at least in this sport. So, it's sad that there's not been enough of that now being done, which is why HistoryMakers is so significant and so important. But we're doing our best to make sure that, thank God, a lot of this stuff was preserved, but it's been in boxes and stored there for years, and we're in the process of have those things at the Hall of Fame, but even in our own headquarters, trying to make sure that much of what represents the growth of the movement and the growth of African Americans in sports resort.
DeMaurice, in professional football?
Yes, for me personally, when I was elected in 2009, unfortunately, Gene Upshaw had already passed away. I've always been a student of history, and so early in 2009, I decided that the only way I could learn was to really crawl through the union's archives itself, and thankfully found out, much like Michele and Tony have talked about, that the union had done a really good job of preserving a lot of documents and a lot of its own history. And we started a project that we're almost up to speed, almost up to date now with digitizing all of the information. But we also started, it was important for me to talk to people. So I was fortunate enough to have Bobby Mitchell around. I was fortunate enough to have Freeman McNeil around. And so after I started talking to them about our history, it became important for us to just start to record our oral history. So, we're fortunate enough now to have hundreds of hours of that oral history done as well. And we've started a process of talking about where we're going to house our papers. And we've certainly, after last week's call, are probably going to make a decision about with respect to the HistoryMakers, because I do think it is very important that we not only preserve and tell our stories, but in the sports world, we let our stories be told more often than not by sports writers and by folks who work for newspapers. And the blunt honesty there is sometimes they have a little bit of a different agenda about the way that they want to tell the story about African Americans and people of color and the history of unions and what really goes on behind the scenes. Sometimes their interest in telling the story isn't exactly the same interest or the same goals that we would have as people of color engaging in a narrative that we know is inextricably tied to race and power. And if we don't tell our story using our own documents with our own voices, I think shame on us. So, we've got a great staff, and I'm happy to say that a lot of those documents and oral histories are already digitized. But I think the next step is, how do we make sure that we tell the story in an accurate way from exactly the voices of the people who were our presidents and who were our team leaders fighting the fight.
And now we'll bring back Oscar Robertson and John Wooten as well to ask the entire panel, have you searched for and/or found a permanent repository for your own personal papers and photographs? Start with you, Mr. Robertson.
I'm working with HistoryMakers to pick an appropriate place, to be honest.
And as for you, John Wooten.
No, Jay, I have not. That is something that I really don't put a lot of emphasis on in terms of where I came from. I'm very blessed and fortunate to have had the opportunity to do the things that I have, but it's just not something that relates to me. But I will, D. Smith made a very, very important talk there, and he pointed out the fact that Bobby Mitchell should be given total credit for what this league went through in terms of his going from us there to Cleveland Browns to Washington. And I am just exhilarated every Sunday when I see the players wearing that 49 on their sleeve, on their chest rather. It is just outstanding, because I know what Bobby Mitchell went through dealing with Preston Marshall down there in Washington in 1962.
Following that, D. Smith, what about your own personal papers and photographs? Have you sought a place to archive those?
Yeah, well, my papers will stay with the union. I think wherever we decide where the union's papers, where our story goes, and we're going to work with HistoryMakers as well. I think anybody who wants to read whatever I have to say, I don't really know who that might be, but I think it's important, going back to things that everybody said, when so much of what I do and what we all do is influenced by the personal stories of the people that have influenced us. And on the baseball side, I had the wonderful opportunity to spend time with Marvin Miller before he passed away. I'm not sure that any of my papers are much different than what I would want or where I would want the union's papers to go. But I do think it's really important that we engage in a deliberate effort to tell the stories from the perspectives of the people who actually went through it. And every time I look at that picture of the Cleveland Summit, for example, I've had the opportunity to talk to two of the football players who were in that picture to talk about what it meant to show up there with Muhammad Ali at that point in history. To me, it's extremely important not to leave that to someone else telling the story. I think it's important for our country and for our history, for our country and for our community to hear exactly from the words of the people who went there and did those things.
And Tony, your leadership time has coincided with such an incredible period of transition for baseball. I'm sure there'd be a lot of fascination as to your personal recollections of what these moments have been like. Have you sought a place to archive your personal memories and photographs from this time?
I haven't yet. As I highlighted earlier, we are in the process of digitizing all of our files and documents. Haven't quite gotten to mine yet, considering our history, but I know it's a conversation we undoubtedly are going to have. And much like Dee had highlighted, we have our history front and center with us on staff, along with a lot of the video interviews that we were able to do with Marvin and those that came thereafter. And from a player standpoint, from Steve Rogers, who goes back to the early 70s, and Dave Winfield, Bobby Bonilla in the 80s, and Phil Bradley, and a number of others. We have our history as an organization from a former player standpoint on staff that just about ranges from start to finish. And so we are in the process of engaging the folks we have on staff, along with, as I mentioned, archiving a lot of the video and documentation that we have. But it's a conversation we're going to have. Hopefully, once things settle a bit and we come out of the other side. But you're right, there is indeed a lot going on of late that is being documented as we speak that we'll have to find a home for once the dust settles.
And Michele, your personal history is particularly historic as the first woman to lead one of these unions. What are your plans as for how you will document that and preserve that history?
Frankly, I hadn't planned any of that with respect to my own. And the director of our foundation, as she's been doing work on the larger archive project, has forced me to think about that. And so I thought about it only to the extent that she's made me. Again, we're housing things at headquarters. I know that she's in conversation with HistoryMakers. Most of what I think I have to say, at least about my job now, in my view, that's interesting, is the experience of having been able to have the job. I mean, I remember the first time I met Mr. Robertson, and I was like a giddy school kid. And I actually do have a diary of those conversations with Oscar Robertson, with Russell, a number of the men that created the PA and its success. And so those notes are notes and I would think folks might be interested in hearing and reading about, because it's simply what is the most exciting part of the job, and is being able to sort of have a nose under the tent and do these incredible men. So we're working on it, because I absolutely agree that these are stories that should be told by those of us who've lived it and by the men who lived it, as opposed to relying on someone who may be in the business, in the sports business, but if they've not walked in the players' shoes or otherwise been completely aligned with the players, then there's a tape that is missing if the story is only told by them.
Now we want to open up our panel for Q&A, and with us today is our panel. They are the members of the HistoryMakers SportsMakers Advisory Committee. They're working to guide the work of the HistoryMakers in the area of sports. The committee includes our special guests, Oscar Robertson and John Wooten, corporate lawyer and founder of the celebrity golf tournament, the Fellowship Open, John W. Daniels Jr., the second African-American woman to ever play the Ladies PGA Tour, Renee Powell, retired PGA executive, Ernest Ellison, the first African-American to win the Grand Am, Bill Lester III, sports administrator, Kathleen Francis, and retired basketball player and executive, Wayne Embry. And our first question will come from Ernie Ellison.
Oh, wow, this is great. Nice to meet everyone and listen to the history. My question is centered around the economics of sports. It's a billion-dollar industry across all sports. I mean, it's really huge. But what are we doing to ensure that there are opportunities for the athletes as well as other consumers that are Black to participate on the economic side of sports?
And we'll start with D. Smith.
Yeah, well, I think the history on the economic side of our business mirrors the history of the labor side. All of us, Michelle, Tony, myself, have talked about sitting across the collective bargaining table and not seeing people who look like us. I think that if you look at the economic side of our business, it's probably exactly the same. Until we decide that we have to fight for a level of economic, or let's just call it economic opportunity diversity, in the same way that we're fighting for other things, I don't think it changes. So, we're interested in, and we've had conversations with the league about opening up preferred partners and vendors and contractors who could be former players or people of color. I think when you look at something like stadium construction, for example, there's been far more strides with increasing the diversity on that side, thanks to other labor unions who have entered into project finance or project work agreements with stadium builders in certain jurisdictions. Most of that has been successes of other labor unions. So, to me, the issue is not only the diversity among coaches, the diversity among people at the team executive or league executive level, but your point is a correct one. How do we achieve a level of economic and opportunity diversity that truly stretches across every aspect of what our business is?
Tony Clark?
I would agree with everything Dee just mentioned. It's going to require either language in a contract or language in the collective bargaining agreement that requires certain relationships to be built and fostered and certain interests to be manifested in a way that's a little bit different, perhaps, than they have been before. Those conversations with the league have happened, will continue to happen unless or until progress is made. It has been a remarkably slow process, unfortunately, but that's not the result of the interest and commitment to diversity and change and those conversations as a whole. So much like Dee represented, it's going to require continued diligence and continued commitment and engagement in order to build the relationships, in order to provide the opportunities that all of us are committed to. As PAs, we do the work that we need to do in the areas that we can do it because we control those conversations and we can control those engagements. It takes two to tango at the league level and at the table such that it effectuates the type of change we've been talking about both on and off the field. And we'll keep pushing as long as we have air in our lungs to get there.
And Michele Roberts.
Sports is these are multi-billion-dollar businesses. And when I got the job, I was surprised at the constellation of different businesses that are making money from these players. I mean, it is amazing. And the tendency as executive directors of the PA is to concentrate on enriching our players. That's obviously our primary responsibility. But when you begin to look at around the 360 degrees of the sport, you realize that there's a lot of money being made by a lot of people that don't look like me. And so having the conversations with the league is important, but the engagement, I mean, I can get the league to promise to make a commitment to diversity all day long. But if we don't measure and cajole and remind and then publicly shame if we have to, then we're not going to make a difference. Certainly internally in the PA, we have a policy of diversity and inclusion that extends to people that do business with us. If you've got a problem in that area, then you've got a problem doing business with our PA. And frankly, we're now pushing the league to have the same commitment to diversity and inclusion. If you've got a problem with diversity and inclusion, you shouldn't be making money on sport that is so diverse. And so when it comes to who manages our pension plans, when it comes to who's cleaning our facilities, there's no end in sight to the ways that we can improve diversity and inclusion in our sport. But it does mean paying attention, and it does mean not assuming it's going to be done. The engagement is critical. We're getting better at that. This year has made it especially a more keen issue for us to pursue. So we're aware of it.
And our next panelist question comes from Bill Lester.
Well, yes, really mine's not a question. It's really more an observation. And that is just commending the three of you as representatives, high-ranking representatives in major stick and ball sports to get to the position that you're in. I think it's quite tremendous. My career, my background is in professional auto racing, and there is no players, association, and there is no real protection with regard to the race car drivers themselves. We're all independent contractors. So I can't imagine what it would be like to, for example, be in NASCAR and have a drivers association that protects us as drivers, because it doesn't exist. We're kind of like the wild, wild west. NASCAR is independently owned by the France family. It doesn't have the structure that Major League Baseball, National Football League, and baseball, football, and basketball, National Basketball Association have. So for you all to have achieved to the position that you have, gravitated to and ascended to, I think is just tremendous. And I just wanted to commend you on all the efforts that you're making, and to encourage you to continue to do the great work that you're doing.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Lester.
you. Thanks a lot.
Now,
The one thing I would add is, I watched the documentary on the Willie Ribbs story that was on Netflix. All of us are only here because players before us made tremendous sacrifices, and for the most part paid a unimaginable cost for trying to make the lives of players, athletes after them much better than the lives that they had. So, none of us got here without people who came before us, and we owe an incredible debt to literally legions of players before us.
and we'll now go to one of the legends who has joined us today, Mr. Oscar Robertson.
Yes. I think that what's going on today is tremendous. I look at basketball and I see where we started from after that 1965 almost stoppage of an all-star game in Boston, Massachusetts. And I see where they're going today. And I see, and Michele, I appreciate you. I appreciate you so much more than I can ever tell you, because under your leadership, they've done fantastic. And I think that players today are more knowledgeable about what's going on in the world. And I'm going to say this, it takes money to do things politically and elsewhere. And if the players who are in the NBA today, they have great plans, as I can see from watching television. And I think that the ones that I'm so happy to see that the players that you hear about are stars. Unlike many, many years ago, there were not a lot of stars who stepped up to the forefront to talk about rights of players and doing things better. But I'm so happy that in this day and age, that the players who are stars are help making decisions because because people respect the players and they know what they're doing and so therefore they can get a tremendous audience. But I must say the communication is what's so necessary because times have changed so many ways. And I'll go off by saying this: no matter what decisions made by the owners or the players, they got to work it together because it's still a game that both sides are making money, and they're going to continue to make money. And I hope they're smart at doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. And it's not the fact that we have so many of our marquee players involved is in no small part a direct result of your involvement. Our players are keenly aware of the history of the game, and to the extent that we can help them, the history of the union. When they hear about even our current marquee players being involved in the union, that gets the average player very interested. And when they talk about the history of the PA and they learn that Oscar Robertson was once the president of the PA, that goes a long way in giving the union credibility. And so I want to make sure that everyone is clear on this. And it's not only the amount of money that the men who started this game, like yourself, Oscar, are responsible for allowing our players to enjoy today, but your courage has inspired our players to even today. They know what risks you took in order to as men, be treated with respect. And they seek only to emulate that and to let you guys know that it was not done in vain. And so your pride in them, I want you to know, is mirrored by their pride in you.
I appreciate that, but I must tell you, I was young and naive during those days, early years. I didn't know what I was getting into.
But you did it. For that, we thank you.
And finally, we will go to Mr. John Wooten. Mr. Wooten.
Thank you, Jay. I can't have words. I don't have words to express how gratifying this has been to me. I'm sure I'm the oldest on this whole panel here group. So I've seen Tony going all the way back to the old Negro League with Jackie Robinson and those guys coming into my community there in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and watching them play baseball and how gratifying this was to me and so forth. And then, of course, Michele, just with Oscar and LeBron and Bill Russell and the relationships and knowing these guys as we did growing up and, and then, of course, the things that we're doing in the NFL. It's just been such a rewarding situation for all of us. And I think that more than anything else is that we have seen these star athletes in all sports stand for what they know is right, that they are part of the community. That old thing that sort of bothered them early on was, well, listen, things are going great for you. You're here to play baseball or football or basketball. What is going on over there in the other section of the community is not something that you should be concerned about. And to see them take the position that I am a part of this, and I think you're absolutely right that it ties into the civil rights movement that we were all part of. And day after day after day, I get calls about the Ali Summit, as they've named it. And we look at those guys, Russell and the football players and all, and you see the fact that the commitment was very simple. Ali had done everything that you're supposed to do. And there was no question that they were going to try to put him in jail, as a draft dodger. And when Jim said, call and get the guys together and meet in Cleveland, the most unbelievable thing about all of this, not one person said to me, hey man, this thing could blow up on us. Or hey man, who's gonna pay for this? Their simple statement is, what time and where are we gonna meet? And that is the way it went. And of course, we gave Ali the opportunity to express himself on National Hookup. And of course, the rest of it is history. The right will always prevail if you give it the opportunity. And I appreciate the opportunity here this morning to express that. Thank you.
And we also have with us HistoryMakers researcher Larry Crow.
Yes, I would just like to speak to the richness of the archive. We have stories that you will never hear anywhere else. We have stories, Billy Williams told us about how he was shot at in the outfield in the minor leagues. We have the story of Chet Walker being poisoned at the NIT before a game. I mean, sports is a lot deeper than people think it is. We have Doug Williams' story of throwing 4 touchdown passes, what he was thinking, on the field as we watched him. We said, well, what is he going to do? His team is behind. He's injured. We have his story of what he was thinking at the time. Harry Carson's concerns about CTE. I mean, it's just a rich, rich archive, and I urge everyone to take advantage of it.
Well, thank you. And as we wrap up, I just want to thank our panelists, Michele Roberts, Tony Clark, DeMaurice Smith, to the extent it's possible to absorb intelligence. I feel like I'm wiser for having shared this time with you, and hopefully all of you watching feel smarter and enriched by this experience as well. And special thanks to our heroes, Oscar Robertson and John Wooten, who represented us so well over the years, both on and off the field. And thanks to the HistoryMakers. The Black history of sports is so much more than the story of the games. There's so much to learn here today, and we hope you'll reflect on today's presentation as a call to action, underscoring the importance of preserving the dynamic sweep of African American history. Time is not on our side.